have a song stuck in my head, but for once, it's a song that I want in my head. I've been catching up with Bob's Burgers, and the Christmas special always gets me every season. I don't know how they keep doing it. They're on their 15th season, and it still hits every time. I didn't grow up with The Simpsons, but I did definitely, not grow up, I guess grow up into adulthood with Bob's Burgers. So Bob's Burgers is really special to me. But the song that's stuck in my head is Seabird, that Yari Jones sang, but it's a cover of the, who are they, Allman Brothers? And it is so beautiful. That episode was really nice. And then the highlight was that beautiful electric guitar rendition of that song. So I will link that video in the description box below. It's so soulful. And you know, shout out to trans performers, especially after what happened with one of their voice actors, especially in the time that we're living in today. There needs to be more of this happening. Hi, my name is Yana. I'm a modern ajma and I read and watch things. And I watched a lot of stuff in January. This is what this video is going to be about, what I read in January. But to be honest with you, the best thing that happened to me in January, which haven't been very many things, you know, but to push the darkness away, I finally binged Keeping Up Appearances, which was a very, very British 90s TV show that stars Patricia Routledge as Hyacinth. Oh my god, how could I forget her last name? Hyacinth Bouquet. And it's just one of those defining moments in my life where I'm like, where have you been all my life? I loved it so much. Everything about it. Patricia Routledge's physical comedy. It made me realize how so many people right now talk like this. And I don't do that personally. I think it's a TikTok thing, is it? Or a Gen Z thing? I don't know. But I just kept staring at the way that Patricia Routledge's equivalent is like this. She keeps doing this. And I, felt in many ways very akin to the character of Hyacinth. We are, alas, a lot alike. And, what I do is this and this, and it's very close to Hyacinth's this, and oh, I just love that show. I first heard about it because of Ben, who I love, and before he was doing his Pride and Prejudice series, which has blown up. I am so happy for him. I'm so proud of him for all of his achievements, but he still does lots of other, very specific to British culture references, and one of them was himself playing the unseen Sheridan. And I was like, who is this Sheridan character? And what is this lady? So I've always meant to watch it just to know what he was talking about in the 2 Instagram reels that he has, RIP TikTok. And now I know. It took way too long to get here. I feel like this is just one of those shows that has shaped who I've always been, and I never even knew it. It just had so many good lines. Beautiful day, Elizabeth. Completely conducive to contemplating cozy, charismatic country cottages. And my husband would hear snippets of it here and there, and ever since he heard this line, he kept saying it back to me. Not if you approach it executively. Take a managerial stance. And of course, who can forget Waterside Supper with Riparian Entertainments. I love it. I read 12 books this month. Let's start with a pretty bad one. I read Flaneuse, Women Walk the City in Paris, New York, Tokyo, Venice, and London by Lauren Elkin, which came out in 2017. I own this physical copy, not gonna lie, because I really love this cover. It looks so whimsical and very promising and, pretty much right up my alley, feminist POV and whatnot. And I've previously read her number 91/92, A Diary of a Year on the Bus, and recall enjoying it, using that word loosely because it is a quite sad and dark topic. of like the Paris bombings. When was that? In the 2000s? Yeah, I found this overall quite bad. This is a feminist, reflective, non-fic narrative. She does that thing where she cites a lot of other writers and their work and the things that they say and their ideas, and she takes them and applies it into her own ideas. All of that is my jam, but this wasn't it. The very low point was when she was in Japan and complaining about the food and the people and looking down on these giggly capitalist Japanese girls in their shopping malls as she is in the more superior minimalist Muji store in the same mall. It was just a lot of like very white woman huffy entitled judgment. She like praises France. I think she's American, but she is an expat and lives in Paris, and she hates America, she hates Japan, she loves France, says it's the best place on earth, and the French are the best people in the world. Like, whoa, how very American of her to proclaim who is the best, and you know that she is the best and that she's better than everybody else. There's also some Virginia Woolf praise here. See, it's a red flag. I will die on that hill. The one good thing that I will say about this book is that this is a reflection of the time, of a very shitty time in her life when she was going through a very bad breakup and feeling really misunderstood. But to what end? Am I misunderstanding how terrible she is? I guess so. Yeah, hard no. I read 8 Bears, Mythic Past and Imperiled Future by Gloria Dickie, which came out in 2023. This was recommended by Audrey, and I love Audrey. I love all of her recommendations. I was gonna say non-fic recommendations, but her fiction recommendations are fantastic as well. I read this primarily as a library audiobook read by Cassidy Brown, but to my ears, she sounded exactly like J. Smith Cameron. So there's that added pleasure to the reading experience. This was so great. And she's a fantastic reader, which was just a cherry on top of this fantastic, fascinating read. I was enjoying this immensely, even though the subject is very dark, because people are terrible and bears are wonderful. And I will forever think about bile bears. If you're curious to know what that is, or what in the world 8 kinds of bears are, do read this book. It is for you. I finally understand panda diplomacy. No, I read the news, but do I retain it? Do I like really understand it when I read it? With the whole panda diplomacy thing, apparently not. This book really finally, concretely got it through my head what that's all about, how that affects all of us, people and the bears. I just never thought about pandas before. Like, who likes them that much? There's a very interesting rundown of some very famous bears, like Paddington and Baloo of Jungle Book. And even for those, their human creators are terrible and just ignorant of reality. I just found this so enjoyable, so fascinating, so sad. I really love this. And it's so random. A book about bears. Who would have thought for 2025? But yes, this is like probably one of my favorite non-fics that I've read. Definitely in the past several years. I read A Woman of Pleasure by Kiyoko Murata, translated by Juliet Winters Carpenter. I read this as a library audiobook. It was read by Susan Momoko Hingley. It made me do a double take. Like, I was thinking that I was reading another nonfiction, but it's a fiction book. It's a novel. It's just written so factually to its benefit, because the writing style of it really gets across the message that even the title, A Woman of Pleasure, isn't a woman's pleasure. It's a woman of pleasure, like for other people's pleasure, for men's pleasure. A woman is needed for men to have pleasure, and just everything down that bumpy ride of patriarchy. It made me laugh. It made me think. It's historical fiction because it's set during the early 1900s in Japan. Daughters of samurai had no need of straws or smiles to train their mouths below. They achieved their desired result by twirling their halberd and yelling battle cries. Lines like that, I just guffawed IRL. And then haikus like this made me think and ponder. Young bamboo, from the stalk emerged, a tiny princess. How very odd it must be to have a stranger's baby. Completely illiterate, they couldn't write even their own names. They didn't know that the earth was round, or that it orbited the sun, or that life on earth depended on sunlight. They had never been taught anything of the world beyond their kitchens at home. Now they would devote their lives to learning about and finally coming to know one thing: men. I really enjoyed this as well. It felt so much like nonfiction, and the audiobook is great. I don't recall how it got on my radar, but it just was one of the plethora of audiobooks lined up in my Libby holds, and it came through, so I just was reading it very quickly, found myself enjoying it. I think I gave it 4 stars, so I liked it enough, but you know, I really liked 8 Bears a lot more. I read Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less by Greg McKeown. Oh, I think he's British or Scottish or Welsh. He's UK in. Forgive me not knowing how to say his last name. Again, as a library audiobook, and it was read by the author. This book came out in 2011, and I thought it was a very new year, new me on theme choice. However, I thought that it was going to be more about buying less, you know, no buy type of book, but it's not at all about that. It is all about how to say no, striving for more balance and goal-oriented decisions. I realized at once that this book was very much not for me, with the line, "For us type A's." I lolled at Bill Clinton's quote of every mistake he's made in life is from sleep deprivation, like not getting enough sleep. Okay. This is definitely a self-help type of book, very much skewed towards like corporate people in corporate jobs or pursuing corporate jobs. I don't know who needs to be told not to take a meeting while they're at the hospital right after their child was born. You know, if that is you, I guess this book is not at all the first thing that you would probably need. But you know, having said that, by no means do I disagree with everything that this book says. Like, it's very hokey to me, but for the most part I stand, because yes, make healthy choices for yourself and prioritize what's important. Not gonna lie, I very much wanted to DNF until the final 20-ish%, because the first 80 is like a lot of corporate talk. But then that last 20, it applies the thinking, the essentialist thinking, into other places, such as like the police department and schools and at home. So there's that. I've been seeing a lot of like, you know, big famous people talking about essentialism. That's why I decided to read it. You know, it wasn't at all what I was expecting, because just in my head at the time, I was in a very much like, okay, this year I am on a no buy or a low buy, on a very strict low/no buy. But then, you know, once I thought about it and got out of my head, it made sense. This is the type of book that all these very goal-oriented, hyper type A people are like constantly citing and praising. Corporate life is so dismal. I read Rejection by Tony Tulathimutte, which came out in 2024. I read it as a library audiobook again, which is read by a full cast, like a different voice per main character. And this book has been on so many people's top 10 lists from last year. And the main reason why I wanted to read this is because of it being mentioned by Gia Tolentino, who praised it so highly. She said a lot of really interesting, smart things about it. This is probably the funniest horror book I've read. It's not a horror genre. I'm just saying that it's a very scary, it reflects our very scary times. It is the smartest thing that I've read on the worst kinds of people right now. Oh, this was smutty. The sympathy ode for incels that we didn't know we needed, because ultimately it's shaking us out of our autopilot, right? It's challenging our echo chamber, like our bubble. We're only as safe as our most vulnerable are. Of course, I didn't like any of their actions. I'm not defending any of these characters for what they did or how they think, but Tulathimutte just writes each character so empathetically. It is so, like, it's actually very sweet. Like, it actually makes me think each character is very sweet. which is a magic trick of its own. Yeah, this book was very much a dark horse. Gia Tolentino, in the same video, also praised Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth by Ingrid Robeyns, which also came out in 2024. I read it as a library audiobook, read by Rachel Babbage. However, it was just, another book that I was reading from the library, and I loved it so much. I ran to my Barnes & Noble to get this. It just felt like a book that I needed to own. So this broke my low/no buy. However, I was lucky enough to find this in like the Barnes & Noble 50% off hardcover sale. This was paradigm shifting. I only say that about a handful of books. I should do like a paradigm shifting book video. Yes, mental note. This is terrifying. This is all about how wealth undermines democracy and argues that instead of putting money into poverty, we should take out the money from the, 0.0001%. It talks about inequality versus poverty, wealth versus income. It brings up how talking about poverty is safe as opposed to talking about wealth, because talking about poverty doesn't require having to talk about the economic injustices, because that raises the topic of privilege. And yeah, just trickle down economics, it doesn't work. We need to fucking stop falling for that. It is so hard to read the news right now. But probably the biggest eye-opener that this book gave me is I am just another elitist / educated person telling undereducated people what's better for them, just like how the yuppies did to blue-collar workers like around the mid-late 20th century. We keep acting like we're on the same side when we're really not, and we need to stop doing that. This is the root of why so many moderate to like liberal Democrats had so many assumptions going into, the past several election cycles, and why we're so shocked every time at the way that things are turning out. I highly recommend this to anyone who is cognizant right now and trying to find a way to think about things. You can agree or disagree on premise to the argument of this book. Nevertheless, it is such a good read. It's very important. I read 3 Agatha Christie's this month, all 3 on audiobook, despite the fact that I own physical copies of all 3 of them, because I found out that there is a new Juliet Stevenson read, Miss Marple, The Complete Short Stories, which came out in 1985. However, the physical copy that I own is titled The 13 Problems, featuring Miss Jane Marple, also published as The Tuesday Club Murders, which I'm pretty sure when I was reading it as a kid, checking it out of the library, that was the title that I checked out. But now it is renamed as Miss Marple, The Complete Short Stories. And Juliet Stevenson adds her particular je ne sais quoi to the Marple voice. She is wonderful, droll, soothing as always. I just love reading a very familiar, beloved book with a new voice. I love Juliet Stevenson as an audiobook narrator, and she is prolific in audiobooks. She has read so many titles. I endeavor to read through them all. And yes, her reading an Agatha Christie, a Marple no less, is just gilding the lily for me. Miss Hellier paused, slightly out of breath, and it was borne upon her audience that the outside of Jane's charming head was distinctly superior to the inside. Savage. And I read Poirot Investigates because I saw that there was a new audiobook read by John Rubinstein. Interesting new take. The audiobook that I read for Poirot Investigates was read by David Suchet, who plays Poirot in the TV show. I'm not a fan of David Suchet as an audiobook reader because he owns that Poirot role, that voice, so much to its detriment. He puts everything into the Poirot voice. And then the rest of the characters, like the accents, are terrible, absolutely terrible. But vice versa, John Rubinstein's characterizations of all of the different characters, wonderful. And then it's his Poirot that's a little bit more lacking. I don't think it's because I am holding, David Suchet up on a pedestal at all. It just is. I feel like he's you know, scared to approach the tiger, which is fine. I prefer the better range, and it was enjoyable. The stories themselves, I didn't really care for it. It all felt more or less like sketches for ideas for fuller novels that Christie never really pursued. Most of the stories are like international, not necessarily espionage thrillers, but definitely less like rich family on a countryside estate, which is really my personal preference for an Agatha Christie. So I'm pretty sure I gave this like 2 stars or something. However, I watched every Poirot adaptation of each story in this book, and I loved so many of them. My favorite was The Mystery at the Hunter's Lodge, the adaptation for it, because it is set on a countryside estate, but just everything about it, the premise, the pacing, the way that it was told, the visuals of the adaptation, it was done so well, and it was so entertaining. That's what we want out of something like this. That's the whole point. It made me realize, because I really prefer Miss Marple so much more than Poirot, but there are just so many more Poirot titles than there are for Miss Marple. I'm really whatever about David Suchet as a performer of all sorts. I find the character Poirot himself to be very annoying. And also the Poirot, the adaptation, the series, it ran from like the 1980s, I think. And the final ones were in like the early 2000s, I think. And so those are interesting to watch just to see what, you know, famous British faces were on there before they got really big. You know, people like Michael Fassbender, Emily Blunt was in like Death on the Nile. But for, you know, a lot of the smaller, lesser known titles, I see why the show was so popular. It really provided a like visual addendum to these stories that are beloved, and you know, that's kind of rare. Most people prefer the book and find the film or TV adaptation to be more lacking. The joy that I got from this Poirot Investigates reread is not just a new audio narrator, but seeing the show Poirot in a new light and appreciating it more. And then I read Sad Cypress because I was on this huge Poirot show kick, and one of the episodes that I also watched was Sad Cypress, and the adaptation for this title was also very good. It was also very compelling and dark and sad, and it just made me want to revisit the book again. So it was a nice like Sunday afternoon type of read for me, where it wasn't necessarily like a smiley feel-good type of book, but a, you know, pretty sad narrative of a woman being used, of a woman discovering that she can be cosmopolitan. She gets out from her small town only to be a pawn for another person for a pittance. I read Good Girl by Aria Aber as a library audiobook read by Mozan Navabi. This has been making the rounds on BookTube. This is a new release. I think it came out this month, and by this month I mean January. It is the first big new release that has been making the BookTube rounds. I really enjoyed this too. Again, this is another like dark, sad for women narrative about a very young Muslim Arab woman who unfortunately gets entangled with probably the worst fuckboy that I have read. Like, just the most transparently bad fuckboy that I've probably ever read. And I love that trope. I personally fall for the fictional, literal fuckboy and find them so enchanting. But this one, who I thought this is so delicious, is described as an ashy carrot. Might as well have been wearing a red flag over his entire body. I felt so bad for the main character, how much she was dealing with. Like, she just harbors so much guilt over her own identity, her immigrant family, her poverty, and then that feeling of excitement arising from like an illicit double life. And in her case, it's the early 2000s Berlin club scene, which I hear so much about. and just reaching too high because she surrounds herself with a group of friends who she feels are just way too cool for her. They're creative, they're artistic, she wants to emulate them. I also like this line. They care way too much about David Foster Wallace and not enough about deodorant. So this was quite well written. I enjoyed this a lot. But the overarching feeling that I got from this reading experience was the reminder of how shitty the 2000s were. In the 2000s, I also was not racially ambiguous because I look Asian, but I also harbored much shame in my Koreanness at the time in the 2000s. It was hotter to be Japanese because of all of the cool Japanese stuff coming out at the time. And, no one knew what Korea was or what Koreans were like. And I would never pretend to be Japanese and lie about it, but I just felt that shame. And also there was just so much normalized racism and violence, like both in your private family life as well as in, public spaces, like what we saw on screen and how it was glamorized. So this was one of those like nostalgic reads that made me think how nice it is that it's not really like that anymore. It's not a huge change today compared to back then, but it is different. There's a lot of uncomfortable scenes in this book, and I'm glad that it feels uncomfortable now to read it now. I recommend this if you want to read something equally entertaining and smartly written and a nostalgic to the 2000s time. I read All in Her Head, The Truth and Lies Early Medicine Taught Us About Women's Bodies and Why It Matters Today by Elizabeth Comen. I'm pretty sure I read this because I saw it in like the Goodreads awards list and it just sounded really interesting. This was a very compulsive read. I personally enjoyed the righteous indignation. This is all about a female doctor, she's an oncologist, trying to PSA to all the women out there to advocate for their own health more and to be more vocal about their needs. How things such as, for example, the one that hit me hard personally is that having to pee a lot or pee dribbling after giving birth multiple times is not normal. She also reframes how people have always thought about a notable person in medical history, such as Typhoid Mary, how things like breast implants came to be. Yeah, I just really believe that this is coming straight from a woman who really just wants to help other women navigate the historically patriarchal system of medicine. I have no notes. I feel very informed. Her fury is palpable. On average, women gravitate towards working with people, while men prefer to work with things. It struck me then that our modern medical establishment, in which doctors self-select early into specializations that focus on just one system or body part, too often treats our patients like broken things in need of fixing, rather than people in need of care. Oh, powerful. I read The Undying, Pain, Vulnerability, Mortality, Medicine, Art, Time, Dreams, Data, Exhaustion, Cancer, and Care by Anne Boyer, in tandem with All in Her Head, which was a very happy coincidence because I had no idea that this book is about cancer. I've had this book for years. I admit that it is a vanity purchase because I just love hardbound books like this that are this size, this thickness. It's a very striking spine, a striking cover, and Katie Merchant from Thank You OK recommended it. And that is all it takes for me. Oh, and I also read this for Ben's Read Good Challenge. And January is Annuary. Read a book with Anne in either the title or the author. And this was an immense surprise because not only did I know that it was about cancer, but I just was blown away by how well written this was, just how very real this feels. It made me realize that more people should read more books written by thinky writers such as Anne Boyer about health journeys. I've always felt this way about how people should read more books about postpartum, especially if you're a person who is considering pregnancy and raising a child. I must now extend that to all other health topics. I've always been a person who'd rather know than not know about things because it prepares me. I don't feel like it's morbid of me to feel this way. We're all going to die somehow. We're all going to go through some of these things. It's better to know than not. I mean, this is why we read, to gain insight into other people's experiences and gain more empathy for the human experience. I've never personally had to take care of a loved one with cancer going through chemotherapy, but I know several people who have gone through chemotherapy, and I just had no idea that this is what goes on. And if I ever do have to, I will immediately go back to this and refer to this book. I just feel like this was a beautiful way of warning. Like, this is how it is. Beauty in the sense of a well-articulated, thoughtful account of the human condition. This is editing Yenna, the editing troll Yenna today. And I am editing this January video that I recorded well over a month ago at this point, and I've just been sitting on it. But while I was editing this Undying portion, I had a very lovely chat with Bibliosophie, who I also love, and we were talking about this book because we both read it for January, and I was telling her that if anything, my biggest take from this, like the biggest lesson learned from this book is like, once I googled how does one get cancer, or like how does one get over cancer, like can cancer, I know that there's no cure for cancer, that's like the biggest health concern, but like, you know, there's more than one kind of cancer, there's lots of different kinds of cancers, and you do hear about so many people surviving cancer. So what is the difference? So I was Googling, what is the difference between all those cancer survivors and the people with cancer who did not survive? And my biggest lesson that I learned from this book is that, like with so many things, it has to do with like your socioeconomic background. For example, Anne Boyer was a economically struggling single mom. She had to go to work while receiving her chemotherapy treatments, and nevertheless, because she is a white woman and she had a lot of help, her single mother status regardless, those types of factors were what helped her survive all the more. And if you are a person who do not have those things working for you, your chances of survival are less likely. So it just never occurred to me how a lot of the, general health recommendations of living a well-balanced lifestyle with a good diet and regular exercise and daily stretching, all of that kind of has to do with things like, if you ever get cancer, it might push you towards survival rather than not. So now I'm going to read a couple quotes that I pulled that I found very thought-provoking or beautiful or enlightening. Someone once said that choosing chemotherapy is like choosing to jump off a building when someone is holding a gun to your head. You jump out of fear of death, or at least the fear of the painful and ugly version of death that is cancer, or you jump from a desire to live, even if that life will be for the rest of its duration a painful one. Every person with a body should be given a guide to dying as soon as they are born. I cannot recommend this enough. Whether or not you have cancer or know anyone with cancer, it's just something that is such a prevalent thing, not just cancer itself, but frailing, deteriorating bodies and and just being less able-bodied. That's gonna happen to everybody. And yes, so many people go through cancer. You will eventually know a few of them. And it is important. Like, I wish that I had read this years ago. But, now I have read it. And now I'm about to, if they're open, ask all of my... I had an aunt go through chemotherapy. And she survived breast cancer. And she has said, and I do recall her saying, she would rather just let death come than go through chemotherapy again for a second time. And at the time, I just probably brushed it off and, casually thought, well, that's how she feels, so be it. But now I understand a little bit more why she could say that. It's a big thing if you are sick with something to choose no treatment. And a lot of people, whatever their reasoning may be, are against that. And I just wish for more dignity for every human being. And I will start by recommending this book to everybody. So that was everything that I read in the month of January. My favorite read is probably 8 Bears, just because it put such a big smile on my face. I feel like Limitarianism was the most important book of the month, but probably like the most life-changing thing that I consumed this month is Keeping Up Appearances. If you haven't checked that show out yet, and if you're British pilled like me, and you love a good classic 90s sitcom, this show is for you. I was really surprised to see how much reading gets done in that show. Like Daisy and Onslow are always reading in their house. It was lovely to see because, you know, they're supposed to be like poor, uneducated people, but they are constantly reading stuff. It was just such a delight of the month. And so far, 2025 is off to a pretty great start. We are rolling through the year, and I'm very excited to see what is in store for this year's reading life. As always, I never know what to say in my outros other than thank you for watching. If you have read or heard about or have any thoughts on any of these books or shows, please let me know in the comments, and I will see you again very soon.